Good morning. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Intercouncil Network webinar, Rethinking Public Engagement Approaches Through a Decolonial, Anti-Racist, and Feminist Lens. I'm Ghazoual Ouelghi-Saada, and I'm the Intercouncil Network National Program Manager. Bonjour et bienvenue au webinaire du réseau de coordination des conseils, repenser les approches d'engagement du public à travers une perspective décoloniale, antiraciste et féministe. Je m'appelle Ghazoual Ouelghi-Saada et je suis la responsable du programme national du réseau de coordination des conseils. Before we begin, there are a few technical items to note. This webinar is being recorded. We have simultaneous interpretation available. To select your preferred language, you will find a globe icon at the bottom of your screen for interpretation, which you can use to select the language you'd like to listen to. Nous avons l'interprétation simultanée. Alors, pour sélectionner votre langue préférée, vous trouverez une icône représentant un globe terrestre au bas de votre écran. Cliquez dessus pour sélectionner la langue dans laquelle vous souhaitez écouter le webinaire. If you have any difficulties with the interpretation, closed captioning, or any other technical issues, please reach out to us in the chat and we'll do our best to help resolve them as quickly as possible. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais vous présenter brièvement le réseau de coordination des conseils. Le RCC est une coalition regroupant les 8 conseils provinciaux et régionaux pour la coopération internationale. Ces conseils luttent pour la promotion de la justice sociale et du changement social à travers le monde et représentant plus de 350 organisations de la société civile diverses à travers le pays, d'un océan à l'autre. Les conseils sont des leaders dans l'engagement du public et le réseau offre une plateforme nationale qui permet aux conseils de collaborer pour améliorer leur efficacité et identifier des priorités communes en matière d'action collective. Pour en savoir plus sur le travail du réseau, veuillez s'il vous plaît consulter notre site web ou nous suivre sur les médias sociaux. Finally, before we delve into today's content, we would like to acknowledge that we are hosting this webinar in Mi'kma'ki. This is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship with which Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy people first signed with the British Crown in 1726. We ask that we all consider this and the land on which we walk as we participate in today's webinar. We feel it is important to keep this in mind and know and honor the land that we're on. The ICN works with many communities across Canada, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, as well as communities around the world in the international development sector. And we feel it's important to reflect on this, draw lessons from our colonial history, and how this history intersects in many ways with the issues we are facing today in working towards a more just, equitable, and sustainable world. Today's webinar is primarily based on a research project by ICN, the Intercouncil Network, exploring the colonial, anti-racist, and feminist approaches in public engagement. The panel is made up of research participants. We will hear more about them and their work shortly. This webinar will be moderated by Jordan Smith. Jordan is Mi'kmaq woman from Gluska First Nation, who was born and raised in her traditional and ancestral territory of Mi'kma'ki. After graduating from Acadia University, class of 2014, Jordan began working for the Mi'kmaq Physical Activity Leadership Program, where she developed her passion for Indigenous community development. Using two-eyed seeing as her guiding principle, her work is focused on engaging diverse cultures and building strong relationships and youth leadership to create thriving Indigenous communities. Jordan is currently working with the Atlantic Council for International Cooperation as a program officer for the Our Community, Our Voices program, which aims to amplify the voices of young Indigenous leaders in the Atlantic region. She's also a learning facilitator for the Aboriginal coaching modules and plans to volunteer for the upcoming North American Indigenous Games 2023. Now we'll start with a brief overview of the research project by Julianette. Julianette is the ICN policy officer who has been facilitating the research project. Next, we will hear from the speakers, followed by a Q&A session. Please use the chat to introduce yourselves and comment on today's topic. Any harmful, disrespectful, or inappropriate language or comments will not be tolerated. You may also use the Q&A function later to address any questions to the speakers. Over to you, Jordan.
Thank you, Gazua. I'm really honored to be here and excited to participate in this conversation today. And before we get started with our discussion, I'm going to be introducing our panelists, and then we can pass it over to Julianette to hear a little bit about the research. So our 5 panelists today are participants of the research project. Our first panelist is Sonia Adi. Sonia is a Kenyan queer, non-binary feminist, art activist, and creative. They channel their skills and passions for advocacy and storytelling towards advocating for an all-inclusive world where LGBTQ+ people are free to exist as their most authentic selves. This is evident in their work as a program coordinator with an organization that works to enhance the lives and well-beings of intersex, transgender, and gender non-conforming persons in Kenya. Sonia also works as a community organizer at the Queer Hive Kenya, a youth-centered creative and social support organization for lesbians, bisexual, and queer women and gender non-conforming persons. It's really awesome to have you here today, Sonia, and to hear your perspectives on this experience. Our next panelist is John Ciza. John has a master's degree in peace and reconciliation, studying natural resources, environment, peace, and sustainable development from the Catholic University of Bukavu, as well as a bachelor's degree in law from the University of Feshel de Bukavu. He is a university instructor and researcher in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and an activist for human rights and environmental issues. John has contributed several articles on the subject, and he's also the national coordinator of the nonprofit organization Front Commune pour la Protection de l'Environnement et des Espèces Protégées. I hope that I pronounced that properly. There's a very long acronym that goes along with that. So it's really great to have John here today as well. Thank you for your time, and I can't wait to hear from you. Our third panelist is Marie-Eve Marleau. Marie has worked for the past 15 years within social movements against extractivism for ecological justice. She's the coordinator of the Committee pour les Droits Humains and Amérique Latine, an international solidarity organization based in Montreal. They work to defend and protect human rights in reciprocity with social movements and communities in Latin America to fight for social, environmental, economic, and cultural justice. So thank you for being here with us today, Marie. As you can see already, we have a stellar panel. So our next and fourth panelist is Hailey. Hailey is the engagement and evaluation lead at Engage Nova Scotia, a small, independent, nonprofit driven by a vision for a more vibrant, inclusive, and resilient province. Hailey's academic background includes a BA in development studies and anthropology from St. Avex University in Antigonish, Canada, and a master's in strategic leadership towards sustainability from the Bleaken Institute of Technology in Sweden. Her master's thesis considered how participatory community processes build a community's adaptive capacity in relation to the climate crisis. So in particular, that research focused on the collective narrative therapy, a method used to respond to individuals, groups, and communities that have experienced a collective trauma. And both her work and personal life are rooted in the importance of relationships, deep listening. So grateful to have a guest today from my own home territory of Mi'kma'ki. And certainly not last but not least, we have Leticia Rosa Miranda. They also go by Kimmy. Kimmy holds a doctorate in sociology and anthropology and has experience with trans, feminist, and migration studies, as well as gender and sexual identity. They are a researcher and an activist and artist in both Spain and Abyalala. They have been part of the Ecuadorian feminist movement since 1999. And starting in 2008, they began to divide their time between Madrid and Ecuador, along with other activists in Spain. They participated in the Migrants Transgressors Collective since 2009. And Kimmy's skills include research and activist artistic creation, which they have been practicing for over a decade now. So it's really great to have you here today, Kimmy. And now I will pass it over to my colleague, Judy Annette, who oversaw some of this research, and she could tell us a little bit about the methodology and process, the goals of what this research aimed to discover. Over to you, Judy Annette.
Thank you so much, Jordan, and it's good to see everyone here. So just a little bit about this project. My name is Judy Annette, by the way. I'm the policy officer with the ICN, and I've been lucky to be part of this research project that began last year, and it's going all the way up until June. And so our main goal in this work is to basically come up with better ways of being feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial in our public engagement work. And so we have 14 participants from the countries that you can see there. And some of the participants are represented today in the panel. And so we have a few goals that we want to achieve with this project. So one of the things that we want to do is that we want to highlight decolonial work, anti-racist and feminist work going on in different parts of the world, as you can see. And by doing so, we want to sort of assemble different and hopefully better ways of being feminist and decolonial in our public engagement work. And so we hope to share some of the tools and practices that are coming from discussions later on in the year. As we've been doing this, we've come up with different themes that we'll be reflecting on today. And yeah, so we're looking forward to engaging with this topic with you today. And so just to also mention that this is a two-part series. So today we have the webinar, and tomorrow we have a workshop, a CSW workshop that will go deeper into some of the themes that we've been talking about. So you're invited into that as well. Yeah, and we have a link on the chat there. Thank you, Rashni. And yeah, now I will hand it over to Jordan because I'm really excited to hear from some of the participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judy Annette. One of the things that I thought was most exciting about this research project was that there were 14 participants from all over the world. And so I'm really excited in today's conversation to see how some of those lessons from different places can be brought together into our work. So today we have the goal of talking about feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial work. And these are big words that are getting used often now. And through this conversation today, I hope that we can have a better understanding of what do those words mean? And what does it mean to actually apply them into different public engagement activities and practices? So we have learned so much about some great decolonial, anti-racist, and feminist practices from all these different locations. And so one of the first questions that I have for this group is, reflecting on the research project and the methodology of how you came together for these conversations, what are some lessons that you could highlight about things that you've learned in this research? And I think I will pass it over to John first, because I'd love to hear your opinion on your experience and why the methodology here was important.
Merci beaucoup, Jordan. Au fait, dans le cadre de cette recherche que nous avons pu réaliser ensemble, et d'ailleurs qui continue parce qu'il est question de recueillir les différents points de vue, la méthodologie, normalement pour la conduite à bon port de cette recherche qui se veut très cruciale parce que nous abordons les thématiques auxquelles nous sommes confrontés au quotidien, auxquelles nos communautés locales sont confrontées au quotidien. L'option pour une démarche méthodologique s'avère très importante parce que ça va nous servir ou ça nous permettra, n'est-ce pas, de bien adopter une attitude, de cerner les différentes réalités sur le terrain auxquelles sont confrontées nos différentes communautés, s'agissant du féminisme, s'agissant du colonialisme et s'agissant du racisme. Parce que dès qu'on a une approche méthodologique commune et qu'on juge pertinente, ça nous permettra vraiment de ne pas taper en dehors de la plaque. Et ça nous permettra de développer des stratégies pour pouvoir servir d'alternatives pour relever les différents défis. Voilà pourquoi l'option d'opter pour une démarche ou une approche méthodologique dans ce type de recherche qui ont aussi une connotation réflexive sont très importantes.
So what I'm hearing is that for you, it's important to start decolonizing from the bottom up and actually have opportunities for relationships and understanding before you actually can make the decolonizing change within the systems. Sonia, I'm curious, as your experience working with queer and non-binary people, was this methodology important for your communities? And what was it that was important in how this was done?
Yeah, just to echo some of what John said, the whole idea of it being also, is it introspective, or I don't know the correct research terminology for that, but the idea that you also have to interrogate yourself as well as the community around you really worked well for me. Like, that's the best part of this process. For me, like, I came into this process knowing that I wanted to learn, like you said, like, this can be very huge words like decolonial and feminist and anti-racist, and they can even feel intimidating when you don't know what they're supposed to mean. But then when I saw them, I was like, maybe I need to be part of this research process in order to learn, because I felt like I was in that stage of my activism where I needed to come out of that cocoon of where, because I'm working around gender rights, I just need to care about gender rights and nothing else. Maybe I need to look at other aspects of gender rights, like how they connect to land rights, how they connect to climate change, stuff like that. And I feel like being part of this focus group discussions, interacting with activists who from different areas who from different sectors doing different activisms has helped me to see a lot of that, like to start to see the interconnectivity, to start to think deeper about what gender rights, gender and maybe queer rights could mean in the broader perspective of things. Yeah.
That's amazing, because I definitely, a word I had recently learned was intersectionality, and realizing that if you are anti-racism, you have to be feminist as well, and how interchangeable and connected all of these aspects are. And we don't create change and learn from talking with people in our comfort zone that see the same perspectives as us. We definitely create change through conversations of new perspectives. So it's really cool that you got to have that opportunity to learn how these words could apply to your community. I'd like to pass it to Kimmy next, who has worked with a similar community, but has a lot of different experiences. And my question for you, Kimmy, is what does it actually mean to create knowledge in this manner? What does it mean to apply decolonial, anti-racist, and feminism in our research?
Bueno, para mí el feminismo también se convierte, dependiendo de los cuerpos quienes interactúen en el feminismo, se va transformando el término de feminismo, y para nosotros ha sido importante trabajarlo como transfeminismo, por ejemplo, o también hacer, por otro lado, también una deconstrucción del feminismo en términos de que va más allá del cuerpo de la mujer, ¿no? Es decir, no solo es la mujer como objeto de estudio del feminismo. Y por otro lado también consideramos que dentro del método, ya que han hablado mis compañeros anteriormente, considero también que estas intersecciones entre antirracismo, decolonialidad y feminismo también tienen que ver con situaciones situadas, es decir, yo vengo desde América Latina o Adria Ayala en este caso y el Caribe, entonces en este sentido considero también que no se puede hablar lo uno sin lo otro, más en circunstancias de migración desde la cual yo vivo, ¿no? Por un lado. Y por otro lado, también consideramos como colectivo AYU, desde el mundo artístico, vemos que el performance en los espacios públicos ha sido importante para conectar estas realidades frente, en este caso, a una población blanca española, como Adria Ayala que somos, pues es la colonia quien estuvo en Adria Ayala. Entonces, para nosotros es importante la deconstrucción también de las epistemologías de la modernidad, ¿no? Es importante la deconstrucción del discurso que se han hecho sobre los cuerpos travestis, trans o no binarios, y hemos desde este punto de vista rescatado las sexualidades ancestrales, haciendo como una mirada también a la historia y en este caso específicamente a las crónicas españolas, y por otro lado también hacer una resignificación desde nuestras corporalidades y desde nuestras localidades sobre la significación del feminismo para nosotros. Y ha sido también una situación que está llena así de tensiones también y en ocasiones también de conflictos muy, muy duros, sobre todo aquí en Madrid, de donde habito, ¿no? O sea, la relación del feminismo blanco frente a los feminismos racializados o feminismos que vienen de personas migrantes. Entonces, metodológicamente esto ha significado un reto importantísimo, sobre todo porque Madrid para los cuerpos racializados, negros, indios, es muy hostil. Entonces para nosotros ha sido como resignificar todas estas categorizaciones desde otra posición que tiene que ver con la Unión Europea y España en concreto. Eso.
Thank you, Kimmy. I have also found through conversations with international communities a shock in how much of a similar experience that we have faced. And because of that, there's like a sense of connection and a strong relationship built when you realize, wow, you understand or have experienced similar things to me. And yeah, I think that's very, very valid. So now I'm going to hand it over to Hailey, who works with Engage Nova Scotia. I'm curious if there were any lessons from the approach to this research that you took away as someone living in Canada, but getting to engage outside of our country to gather ideas.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jordan, and everyone who's shared so far. I do want to just echo my colleagues that part of what was so important about this experience for me was the opportunity to connect with other practitioners who, like you said, live outside of Canada and create this space for connection and self-reflection as well. Because in my own community engagement practice and my facilitation practice, you know, being self-reflective and learning and unlearning about how I show up as a white settler Canadian who does most of my work in Mi'kma'ki is a journey. And part of, you know, what I enjoyed about this, and there's lots of lessons, and I think we're going to get to them in the other questions about some of those deconstructing of these concepts and these lived experiences, you know, where's the commonalities. But I honestly just really appreciated the opportunity to talk about similar challenges and to learn about other people's programs and projects. Like Kimmy, you know, I really was thinking about the role of art and the arts and activism movements, you know, when we stepped away from our conversations together. And sometimes it was really nice and cathartic just to vent with fellow community organizers and activists and public engagement practitioners about, you know, the frustrations we feel or the very real burnout when you're doing this kind of work. So the space that was created through this approach to research, you know, felt very, very sacred for me, especially when I'm kind of in my bubble here on the East Coast. So yeah, I think that's all I'll share for now. I have some particulars around some of the pieces that really stood out for me, like our conversation 2 weeks ago about, you know, power and the very tangible and intangible role that power plays. And that conversation was quite inspiring for me because I think Sonia, Kimmy, and I were in that conversation together. And quite quickly, we realized that often when I'm in these spaces, and rightfully so, when we're talking about power, we're talking about the abuse of power, either within a systems or a person. And there's this interesting shift in the conversation where we're actually talking about power of relationships and resistance and networks of care that we see in our work. And Paula, one of our fellow researchers, was also talking about, you know, the need to change the meaning and both the sensation of power. And so I reflect a lot on the importance of those intangible and tangible aspects when it comes to public engagement work that's decolonial, anti-racist, and feminist, because when it comes down to it, it's about relationships and trust and intentionality. And for me personally, it's always about, you know, being in a space of learning.
Yes, and Hailey, we will take time to get into some of the lessons that you guys have taken away. But before we do, I will pass it over to Marie, who is viciously writing notes over there. And I'll kind of pull from a comment of Hailey's, which is realizing that, like, oh, what does art have to do? Like, how does art play a role in this work that we're doing? I've definitely found it's hard sometimes to report on a relationship. I built one relationship, but being able to describe the meaning or value of that relationship built is sometimes very difficult within a colonialized system of reporting. So my question for you, Marie, is I know that you worked with ecological justice. I could tell that you've connected a lot with what the other panelists have spoken about. So how does ecological justice, human rights movements, how do these benefit from the experiences of this research?
Merci beaucoup. D'abord, je veux vous dire que je vous salue d'un territoire autochtone à Benaki, non cédé et pillé, situé dans la province dite Québec. J'aime toujours rappeler de la perspective à partir de laquelle on parle, ou je parle, je prends la parole, parce qu'une des choses qui est importante, je pense, dans nos pratiques qui se veulent décoloniales, bon, féministes, entre autres, c'est de reconnaître d'abord nos privilèges, puis de pouvoir aussi les utiliser ou en mettre à profit finalement dans les luttes qu'on mène et dans nos activités de solidarité. Donc, j'appartiens aussi, oui, à un mouvement écologiste, surtout travaillant avec des mouvements en Amérique latine. Puis, une des leçons importantes de pouvoir participer à ce groupe de recherche, puis je dois dire que j'en ai tiré beaucoup d'apprentissage, de réflexion, puis que j'ai pas pu encore partager autant que j'ai voulu avec notre équipe directe de travail dans notre organisation, mais aussi dans notre réseau plus large au Québec. Donc, je vais pouvoir le faire, c'est sûr. Puis, une des leçons que je pense qu'on a tirées, c'est que il est difficile de réaliser des changements réels en étant et en travaillant dans les structures qui continuent d'être capitalistes, qui continuent d'être patriarcales, qui continuent d'être extractivistes. Donc, tout à l'heure, en parlant de l'intersectionnalité, je pense que c'est quelque chose qu'on doit adresser dans nos mouvements. Puis c'est quelque chose qui est revenu beaucoup là, dans nos conversations entre nous, là, dans le processus de recherche, dans les groupes de discussion. Les rapports, dans le fond, d'exploitation puis d'abus pouvoir permettre à une élite de poursuivre cette exploitation de la nature, de notre terre-mère, puis des populations. Donc, on s'était laissé au dernier groupe de discussion en se disant, puis je pense que ça mènera aux prochaines questions aussi, Jordan, mais on s'était laissé en se disant, ben peut-être que c'est justement à partir des groupes de base, à partir des mouvements de femmes ou de personnes marginalisées, puis où on viole leurs droits par rapport à leur genre, par rapport aux communautés autochtones, etc. C'est à partir de ces communautés puis de ces groupes-là qu'on pourra peut-être amener les changements réels auxquels auxquels nous amène la réflexion sur la décolonisation et le féminisme, entre autres. Merci.
That's absolutely beautiful. I believe Indigenous is Indigenous worldwide, something that brings us a lot of connection. And Indigenous communities are making great contributions to towards keeping our climate safe, and yet they still remain some of the most affected by these climate crisis. So, and you also have kind of brought it back around to kind of that power struggle, decolonializing from the bottom up. So our next kind of section is talking about what are some of the tools or strategies that we can actually apply. What are some of the lessons learned that we can take away and actually implement into our work that you took away, especially in terms of public engagement. As we spoke about in the beginning, these are some really big words, and sometimes using them in our public engagement can, if those words aren't understood in the same way by all the people, we may not be getting our point across. So I would love to talk a little bit more about that conversation that you had about the intangible and tangible effects of these colonial systems we work within, and what are some tools and strategies that we can use from the ground up to actually create a change. Sonia, I know that you were involved in a bit of that conversation that Hailey was speaking about. What are some of your takeaways about how we can actually apply this knowledge into our work?
I from the conversation about power, and also something that has just been mentioned here, forgotten by who, but about engaging the community that you're working with, like not coming and dictating over them. That is something that I've had to, like start thinking critically about. I'll give an example. I work with an organization that works with intersex, transgender, and gender conforming persons. And sometimes we do outreaches. We go, we are based in Nairobi, but sometimes we go to smaller towns, to the villages, to just try and create awareness. And was it last week? We went to a place, and for them, they still carry out intersex genital mutilations mostly. It's based on their culture, it's based on religion, all sorts of things. And yeah, we could have been like, we are the people from Nairobi, we are the organizers, we have the knowledge, we are coming to tell you that what you're doing is, I don't know, just try to create this power imbalance where we are the people with the knowledge, you need to sit down and listen. But then we had to also sit down and understand their perspective, where they're coming from, why is this still happening? So I think one of the strategies I think would work, particularly in our context as queer people in a country where we're criminalized, or some of us don't even exist in law, maybe would be that, I know dialogue, I work in a context where dialogue is rarely encouraged, it's radical, there is no dialogue. We are smashing tables, we're doing this, but I think after this engagement, I was like, what if we actually sit down and actually acknowledge, we, just as I am a colonized, I have a history of being colonized, you to have that history. Just as there's certain traumas that I'm working through that are cultural and religious, maybe these people just have it in a different context. And maybe if we sit down and actively engage the community, maybe we'll come to a solution, right? Yeah, and also another thing that I picked up is the importance of history and the importance of art. And I feel, especially in the Kenyan context, how we work in silos in organizing, maybe history isn't something most of us think about. Most of the time you hear people saying being queer is an African, but I'm like, but it is African. We existed in history. It's colonialism and whatever that came and altered or erased history, but it's there. So even in actively engaging these communities, I think going back, just taking a trip down memory lane, and not just history in that way, but also history of how movements formed, right? Histories of how we got here in the first place. Someone talked about a colonized system of reporting, how did we even get here in the first place, right? The history of how we're now fighting for resources, how we're now turning, organizers are turning against each other to fight for resources that are scarce instead of collaborating. I think just doing that could be the beginning of even that, could be part of the dialogue that now creates change.
Yeah, that gender itself is actually a colonial concept that we must work within. And I'm hearing self-determining solutions from the communities, so allowing them to actually create the change that they want to see instead of coming in and creating the change that you would like to have them. I really love listening to them and hearing and learning as opposed to just speaking. there's so much value in actually hearing and learning as well. Sorry, I was just so captivated by that as well. Kimmy, would you be willing to speak a little bit about that conversation about the power struggle and being able to recognize our privilege in terms of using it to our advantage?
Ok. Siguiendo la reflexión con Sonia con respecto a la historia, para nosotros ha sido fundamental también utilizar esta estrategia y herramienta, la misma que no solamente de manera leída como una historia del pasado, sino que la hemos reinterpretado y hemos hecho algunos trabajos que tienen que ver con la producción. Por ejemplo, aquí tengo una producción de un texto que tiene que ver con, que dice "Devuélvanos el oro", que es un texto como producción de la recolección de muchas voces de las comunidades con las cuales compartimos el trabajo, como activistas, académicos y artistas, y también gente de base en distintas modalidades. Por otro lado, también algo más estructural, la lógica del poder en relación a las instituciones del museo, del arte, que son instituciones sumamente elitistas. Entonces ahí podría decir que hay como en parte un privilegio porque somos personas de alguna manera que tenemos una experiencia académica, pero no obstante al mismo tiempo esa experiencia académica no es reconocida simbólicamente, a pesar que es reconocida por el Estado español porque se ha pasado por una universidad, pero simbólicamente ni como cuerpos racializados es reconocida dentro de las instituciones. Y lo que hemos hecho precisamente con nuestro trabajo es criticar, poner en visibilidad la acción que hacen los cuerpos blancos o los cuerpos españoles europeos con respecto a nosotros. Entonces desde ahí para nosotros una estrategia también ha sido estudiar a la blanquitud, es decir, desde las epistemologías del norte siempre el objeto de estudio han sido los pueblos, entre comillas, atrasados, incivilizados, etc. Y hemos sido observados y escudriñados desde todos los ángulos. Y lo que nosotros estamos haciendo es una metodología a la inversa, una forma de poder a la inversa donde nosotros somos quienes miramos a estos cuerpos blancos y denunciamos lo que están haciendo dentro de las instituciones, dentro de las relaciones cotidianas y también dentro de las propias organizaciones cuando establecemos alianzas con las personas autóctonas españolas blancas, ¿no? Nacidas en el Estado español. Entonces eso ha sido como estas relaciones de poder, sin duda han habido tensiones, y como parte de distanciarnos de ese poder también ha sido como traer al presente, como por ejemplo cuestionar también las lógicas queer. Desde este contexto, la lógica queer es muy blanca, a diferencia de Sonia, que es otra realidad de lo queer. Nosotros aquí, por ejemplo, decimos que lo queer no te quita lo racista. Es decir, se puede ser queer y se puede ser racista y también transfobo en este contexto. Entonces también cuestionar a lo queer, al propio feminismo, eso ha sido como una de las herramientas y acciones. Otra de ellas también ha sido como mover comunidad a través de talleres, y estos talleres siempre generando eso, mirando hacia el pasado para reconstruir el presente, y también demandar un poco lo que ha sido la reparación, ¿no? Hablamos también mucho de reparación. Entonces, y la pregunta que nos hacíamos también es ¿quién pide la reparación? Y ahí sin duda alguna se manejan, nos manejamos en esta dualidad. ¿Quién tiene voz para pedir esa reparación? ¿Quién no la tiene dentro de los cuerpos racializados? Que estamos en un contexto además migratorio, en el contexto de Madrid, y eso como que dificulta, o sea, este cuerpo se encuentra al mismo tiempo que privilegiado, también subordinado, es decir, depende de dónde yo me mueva, vivo esas dobles experiencias, es decir, no tengo una sola posición. Dependiendo del tipo de política de la cual yo esté apelando, voy a tener un tipo de subordinación o un tipo de privilegio, y este puede ser simbólico o material, ¿no? Entonces, por lo tanto, en algún momento en los talleres decíamos que el poder tampoco es único, que hay varias formas de ejercer el poder por parte de una y también de ser objeto de ese poder por parte de las instituciones y en nuestro caso por parte de las políticas migratorias de la Unión Europea, ¿no? en este caso, y expresamente por las españolas que tienen que ver, sin duda alguna, con el ejercicio de la expulsión de migrantes, la valla de Melilla, deportaciones express, los centros de internamientos para extranjeros que son cárceles para cuerpos no blancos. Entonces, bueno, ahí no estamos en una categorización de ningún tipo de poder, hay un vaciamiento incluso del sujeto. Y desde ahí nosotros, por ejemplo, replanteamos el sistema de la plantación, que lo trabajan mucho los pueblos negros, tanto en África como la población negra en Atriayala, ¿no? O sea, volver a la plantación es como estar aquí, estar en Madrid para algunos cuerpos es volver al sistema de la plantación, a los estados de excepción, porque hay normativas para unos cuerpos y no para otros. Entonces hay un sinnúmero de relaciones de poder que es muy difícil de ubicarlas, pero al mismo tiempo las sentimos y las percibimos cotidianamente. Bueno, hasta ahí para no extenderme más. Gracias.
Thank you, Kimmy. I recently moderated a youth panel called Reimagining Quality Education. And the youth spoke a lot to what you have said as well in terms of education is outdoors. Education is conversations. It happens in all aspects of our life, not just the colonialized studying from a book. But they've also struggled with recognition of their traditional knowledge as authentic form of intelligence. An Indigenous law student was unable to use a conversation with an elder in his thesis because it wasn't a peer-reviewed piece of documents. So these structures, again, that we work within are limiting the ability for us to move forward with things like that. I also really loved your comment on reinterpreting history. And so I want to pass it over to John, who has a degree in peace and reconciliation, to ask him a little bit about his thoughts on the value of reinterpreting history and why that's an important part of this process.
Oh, I think you're muted.
Merci beaucoup, Jordan, pour cette réflexion qui suscite vraiment beaucoup d'attention. Et ça montre réellement la complexité de notre thématique, notre recherche. Parce qu'au départ, on se disait toujours que le colonialisme, le racisme et le féminisme sont intimement liés. C'est ce qui reflète l'intersectionnalité. Et que l'on soit au nord, les États du Nord et du Sud, chacun a une portion de responsabilité. Maintenant, comment concilier tous ces aspects? Évidemment, comme Laetitia l'a abordé, et même Sonia, où elles ont fait référence, n'est-ce pas, à l'interrogation de l'histoire. Oui, tout part de l'histoire. Nous sommes partis de l'histoire. Nous avons documenté nos différentes cultures et coutumes. Et cela est parti, bien évidemment, depuis l'époque coloniale, quand je prends la dimension africaine et peut-être la dimension latino-américaine. Mais nous ne devons pas perdre de vie. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, nous sommes à l'époque contemporaine, là où nous sommes appelés, n'est-ce pas, à nous adapter à une nouvelle civilisation. Mais dans la pratique, il semble se dégager, n'est-ce pas, un combat entre les réalités traditionnelles avec les réalités contemporaines. Et c'est là où, effectivement, se dégagent beaucoup d'aspects. Par exemple, dans l'analyse du féminisme dans l'ancien temps, est-ce que réellement, par exemple, dans nos sociétés traditionnelles, il y avait la dimension féministe? Et s'il y en avait, si on essaie de comparer avec les réalités contemporaines, qu'est-ce qu'on observe? C'est vrai avec la colonisation, si je prends la dimension africaine, on disait dans l'ancien temps que non, l'homme où les humains, ou donc les hommes, ce sont eux qui étaient les garants, n'est-ce pas, de la famille ou de la société. Mais avec la mutation coloniale, on a changé la sphère. Il y a la réalité occidentale qui veut aussi, qui prend de l'ascenseur sur la réalité africaine. Et du coup, ça crée maintenant des combats. Ça crée des combats. Et c'est là où même, on a observé même dans la pratique la marginalisation des femmes. Parce qu'avec la mutation de l'histoire, il y a des textes juridiques qui viennent, par exemple la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme, qui vient et qui dit que non, voilà, tous les êtres humains sont égaux, ils naissent libres et égaux en droit et en chance et en opportunité. Mais quand nous rentrons dans nos racines, on observe que non, la femme est faite, par exemple, pour garder les enfants à la maison, pour le cuisinage. Mais est-ce que c'est ça la dimension qui doit contribuer au développement de la société? C'est qu'il nous faut maintenant créer une réconciliation entre les réalités actuelles et les réalités anciennes afin de dégager un point de convergence pour un équilibre des rapports, pour un équilibre des forces. Et c'est ça même la philosophie du genre. Parce que nous sommes là pour éclairer la société. Et c'est là où les points qu'a évoqué Sonia par rapport à la sensibilisation. C'est qu'il faut sensibiliser la population, nos communautés locales, pour qu'elles comprennent qu'il y a quand même des acquis que nous pouvons tirer dans nos sociétés traditionnelles. Il y a aussi des acquis que nous pouvons tirer dans la réalité contemporaine afin de bâtir un monde réel, un monde juste, là où les femmes et les hommes interagissent, là où les femmes peuvent occuper les rôles de premier plan dans la société. OK? Là où les femmes peuvent intervenir dans le processus de décolonisation au même titre que les hommes. Parce que nous ne devons pas nous voiler la face. Dans une société extractive et patriarcale comme la RDC, même si on peut dire que nous, voilà, nous sommes victimes de la colonisation, mais par rapport à nos pratiques aussi traditionnelles, est-ce que réellement nous sommes mes propres? C'est qu'il y a des coutumes aussi au niveau de l'Afrique qui nécessitent vraiment une révisitation. Par exemple, si je prends l'aspect des persécutions liées au LGBT, aux transgenres et consorts, est-ce que ces gens-là n'ont pas droit à la vie? Est-ce que ces gens-là n'ont pas droit à la parole? Est-ce que ces gens-là n'ont pas un rôle aussi à jouer dans la société? C'est qu'on ne doit pas voir vraiment le monde ou les réalités sociales sous un seul angle. Et c'est ça la parfaite réconciliation. Il faut réconcilier l'histoire. Et cette réconciliation partirait, n'est-ce pas, des pratiques traditionnelles et des pratiques contemporaines afin de bâtir un monde inclusif et juste, là où les hommes et les femmes doivent conjuguer les efforts pour un avenir partagé. Merci.
Well, John, I think if you just solved all our problems, like that would be the perfect solution, right? I think the first step to that reconciliation is actually an acknowledgement that of the history and its outcomes. And then we can move forward into making a better world together. So I'll pass it down next to Marie, because I'd love to hear from you as well about some tools or strategies that you've drawn from that would be relevant to your work.
Oui, merci Jordan. Je veux remercier là, Sonia, Kimmy, John, puis Hailey. Vous êtes vraiment inspirants. Puis de vous entendre aujourd'hui dans le webinaire aussi, ça permet d'approfondir encore toutes ces réflexions-là qu'on a pu discuter ensemble déjà dans des groupes de travail autour de la recherche. Donc, merci. Je pense que d'un autre côté, le travail qu'on fait par de la reconnaissance des structures patriarcales, colonialistes et racistes et qui mènent, puis extractivistes aussi, je dirais, fait que le Canada pose et impose au monde et aux communautés dans ces rapports-là internationaux. Puis, donc, on a, comment dire, on s'inspire beaucoup des communautés puis des groupes, des mouvements sociaux avec qui on travaille en essayant d'établir des relations qu'on appelle des relations de réciprocité. Donc, John parlait justement de redonner la parole ou de permettre des espaces de parole. Donc, c'est ce qu'on essaie de faire dans nos activités, dans nos actions, d'inviter, dans le fond, nos alliés, nos partenaires à prendre eux-mêmes la parole, puis à nous aider finalement à dénoncer les structures là, qui leur permettent de ne pas jouir finalement de leurs droits puis de leur dignité. Donc, on mise aussi beaucoup, on travaille beaucoup aussi à appuyer l'autodétermination des peuples. Je pense que c'est Sonia qui parlait de ça. Donc, essayer justement de travailler avec les groupes de base pour qu'ils puissent cheminer vers l'autodétermination, puis d'être attentifs aussi à la récupération de nos politiciens, des autorités, puis du secteur privé, dont le secteur extractif, sur des concepts ou des pratiques, comme par exemple la consultation qui devient un instrument qui légitime finalement les projets extractifs sur les territoires et qui continuent là, par l'exploitation des communautés. Donc, c'est un peu la façon dont on travaille, puis je pense que justement en solidarité internationale, comme le milieu dans lequel on s'inscrit, il est fort important d'avoir ces réflexions en continu, puis que ça ne demeure pas seulement des réflexions, mais qu'on puisse les ramener dans le changement de nos propres pratiques au niveau de nos organisations, mais aussi de nos rapports avec les communautés et les mouvements avec qui on travaille. Merci.
I'm having so much fun with this conversation because I also, just in my heart, I'm a grassroots worker, and I feel like a lot of what we do is inspire others to make that change going up the ladder. As you spoke about self-determination, giving a voice, room to speak, I couldn't help but reflect on the OCOF program that I'm working on. We have 9 Indigenous women, non-binary or two-spirit folks who have come together to build relationships and skills and resources for them to advocate for their communities around the SDGs and Agenda 2030. So instead of trying to impact the whole world, I'm providing my peers with the skills to actually make those higher level changes by engaging with their communities and amplifying their voices instead of us trying to capture that for them. So I know, Hailey, I'm sure you're dying to speak now after all these great thoughts. Do you have any reflections or tools or strategies that you have gained in terms of public engagement?
Thanks so much, Jordan. And it's been really lovely to witness the SDG work that you are doing. Yeah, I have lots and much of which has been touched on. But I think the work that I do at our organization is part of the well-being movement, or otherwise known as alternative measurements to progress. And so how do we actually challenge the way that we measure success and progress as a society? And we're trying to move away from just economic measures, right, on that kind of international scale. So GDP isn't a good way to measure how people are doing, or I shouldn't say that, it's not the only way. It needs to be supplemented with more wholesome understandings of how we show up as people, and also recognizing that those knowledge ways are very different in different communities and different cultures. And so we use a different framework And in our relationship building with Mi'kmaq folks here in Mi'kma'ki, recognizing that actually the framework we were using wasn't so adequate because it didn't include other aspects. And so what this makes me think about, and in terms of public engagement and the style of my practice and the organization I work with, is around what are some of those actual fundamental frameworks of progress and success that you're working from? Because in so much of the work that we do, it's quite colonial, right? These ideas of linear thinking, you know, you start a project and the end comes action. And that's just not how, you know, our natural environment works. That's not how we naturally work as people. And so I often think about in some of my public engagement work is 75% of the work is actually what you do beforehand in terms of building relationship with the communities you're working with. First of all, recognizing, you know, were you even invited in? And if not, why? And from an evaluation perspective, spending a lot of time of actually building out a more developmental evaluation style with communities that I'm working with around how do you even want to measure success? You know, how do we want to measure progress? Because I think a lot of us are in these more structured ways of, you know, understanding funding or, you know, a year before you even deliver the project, pretending that you actually know what the outcome's going to be. And it stifles creativity throughout a project or throughout an engagement. And so, you know, are we actually working from the same place of a shared purpose? And we call it walking alongside, because capacity is really big for my organization. Like I recognize I'm coming with, you know, a lot of privilege of being an extroverted person who has an academic background in some of these topics, because I just love the study of people and how we interact and make change. But we call it walking alongside because frankly, I want to work myself out of a job. I hope I've done enough to build the capacity of community, of individuals in it, so that they can then take those skills forward and recognize that public engagement doesn't have to be something that's this specific skill that one person has, you know, like a facilitator. Sometimes I find it's a bit gatekept, and sometimes I actually find public engagement consultants are way too expensive. Like these are natural ways that we come together, and I hope that everybody can know that you also have the skills to do that. And so much of the work comes before in the design of the process, and often, you know, the public engagement itself sometimes is a workshop or an event. But because you've done so much work before, the outcomes of that and then the follow-up are much more impactful. And so, yeah, that's what I was saying, is just kind of starting from an initial spot of, you know, how do you measure success? And similar to what I've been hearing a bit, and Kimmy, I'd just love to read your book. But, you know, recognizing that success also doesn't always have to be the outcome. Like it doesn't always have to be something that, you know, arbitrarily you say that was success. Failure is also a really good lesson in some of these processes that we're doing in community. Yeah, and so it just comes from a place of, you know, challenging also personally. I can speak to really internal colonized views around being in community. You know, I'm always going for that kind of linear way of knowing that I did a good job and I supported community, but how can we just hold each other in more authentic ways of being? Because I think that's kind of the path to real change.
Thank you, Hailey. You have brought us very well into our last question. We have about 10 minutes for us to speak about this topic before we go into an audience Q&A. So my question for you all is there something we could do more of? And we talked a lot about grassroots changes, but is there any call to action that you hope folks on the line, folks watching this today might take away when it comes to like funders, the public? What are the things that we can all be doing to actually make a change? So this time, actually, I'll do it in reverse and start with Hailey. Is there something that you think we could do more of, or what would you like the audience to take away?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of it depends on who I'm speaking to. And so if I'm speaking to folks like me who are public engagement practitioners who maybe have some funding or something like that, or who have the positioning, as I know I do, I've been reflecting a lot on how can I just support people from behind, uplift voices, and just get the money into the hands of folks who need it. And sometimes it can be as simple as that, especially when you've spent the time building trust and relationship.
Yeah, so doing the personal work, putting in the personal time to educate yourself and work on the relationships is equally as important. What about you, Marie? Is there any takeaways that you hope for the audience?
Oui, ben c'est la question souvent qu'on nous pose hein, lorsqu'on fait un événement public ou un événement de sensibilisation. Après, les gens qui sont là nous demandent souvent, bon, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire pour créer des liens de solidarité, puis pouvoir dénoncer aussi qu'est-ce qui se passe, pouvoir appuyer des luttes concrètes, effectivement, de groupes de base. Quand on pose la question aux mouvements sociaux, puis aux organisations avec qui on a des liens de solidarité, ils nous ramènent souvent à notre position géographique. T'sais. Nous, on se trouve un peu dans le ventre du monstre colonial et extractif au Canada, puis on nous ramène souvent à voir qu'est-ce qu'on peut changer ici, dans notre système, dans notre milieu immédiat. Donc, le Comité pour les droits humains en Amérique latine, l'organisation pour laquelle je travaille, on est membre de réseaux d'organisations, puis je pense que d'amener ces réflexions-là pour pouvoir amener des changements réels est vraiment important. Puis, comme je mentionnais tout à l'heure, je pense qu'il faut faire attention aussi de ne pas laisser les pouvoirs en place s'approprier de nos termes, de nos discours, de nos mots, de nos pratiques aussi, parce qu'ils le font, elles le font. Le Canada a développé, par exemple, une politique d'aide internationale féministe et je pense qu'il faut faire attention justement de regarder ces termes-là d'un œil très critique aussi. Donc, merci beaucoup, puis je vais laisser la parole aux autres.
My takeaway from that, Marie, is that it's an ongoing process, that it doesn't ever stop, and that our role is having these reflective conversations and challenging and questioning why things are. So I'll pass it over to John. What would you like the audience to take away?
Oui, pour compléter ou renchérir sur ce que les autres panélistes ont dit, parce que dans une perspective de voir un changement se reproduire à partir de la base, serait d'impliquer tous les acteurs sociaux. C'est-à-dire, dans une perspective, par exemple, de réalisation des actions de développement, et il y a une vision de produire les changements à la base, il faut inclure tous les acteurs sociaux, les membres de la société civile, les officiels, la communauté locale, parce que dans une perspective de dynamique ou dans une dynamique de lutte pour le changement ou pour l'équilibre des pouvoirs, on doit éviter d'exclure les bénéficiaires, parce que ce que vous faites pour moi, sans moi ou sans mon consentement est contre moi. Et donc, on doit partir de ces principes de base et qui est cher en matière de développement. Donc, une participation citoyenne, une participation de tous les acteurs sociaux au niveau de la base serait d'une grande importance et serait l'une des stratégies fondamentales pour atteindre les résultats escomptés. Parce que ce que vous faites pour la communauté, sans leur participation ou leur consentement, est vain. Merci.
Absolutely, engaging with the communities to participate in this process. And I think that goes back to what Hailey was saying about just educating the communities and making sure they understand. So over to you, Kimmy. What would you like the audience to take away?
Soy Kimmy, no entendía lo de Cami, perdón. A ver, una de las cosas que yo quería decir es que me preocupa mucho el tema del progreso, en términos sobre todo más simbólicos, porque, o sea, el progreso dentro de las estadísticas, pues bueno, hay ciertas categorizaciones que definen y hacen y deshacen, pero también hay un progreso que es simbólicamente dado a unos cuerpos y a otros no. Entonces, para mí es una preocupación, por lo menos desde la perspectiva de Colonial para nosotros, es precisamente no hablar de progreso en esta cuestión, porque los cuerpos subordinados no somos objetos de progreso en ningún sentido y por ello las financiaciones van desde esa lógica, hacia los pueblos del sur o hacia determinadas grupos vulnerables o sensibles como mujeres, niños. Entonces es como, a mi modo de ver, entenderlo desde ese punto de vista me cuesta, ¿no? Entonces, y por eso más bien nos distanciamos de la lógica del progreso, porque por lo general, como dijeron hace poco, los países imperialistas son los que han generado este discurso del progreso. Eso por un lado. Por otro lado también, con respecto a los tiempos, o sea, el tiempo en la lógica del progreso, en la lógica de la historia, es un tiempo lineal, ¿no? Un tiempo lineal, mientras que en los pueblos distintos hay muchos otros tiempos, de los cuales tienen que ver más con la cosmovisión, cosmologías o nociones culturales, y en ese sentido mi manera de entender como posibles cambios, ahí están, no como una historia quieta del pasado, sino como una historia a remirar y a mirar desde allí qué es lo que nos da para este presente futuro, porque también por lo menos de los pueblos de Atibayalas no hay un pasado quieto. Para nuestros pueblos el pasado, el presente y el futuro están funcionando constantemente en nuestro mundo contemporáneo. Por eso nosotros a veces decimos, el pasado ya fue. El pasado ya fue significa que mucha historia del pasado colonial se repite y se nos convierte en un futuro. Entonces, eso. Y por último, lo que quiero decir también con respecto a los financiamientos, es que entre los posibles cambios, yo creo que precisamente tendrán que dejarnos de mirar como sujetos subordinados. Es decir, no somos los pobres del sur que no tienen nada y que están vaciados de conocimiento, cultura, infraestructura, ¿no? O sea, esa idea, más que una realidad, esa idea, es una ficción que tiene el norte, de que nosotros estamos vaciados de un sinnúmero de cosas, y que por lo tanto hay que darles, y darles, y darles. No, a mi manera de ver hay que respetar esta cosmovisión que tenemos como propia, y no como un asunto del pasado, no como un asunto de no progreso, todo lo contrario, y respetar esas formas. Esas otras formas que no son las que nos dicen las financiadoras o las ONGs de la agenda, que por la agenda de los financiamientos en el marco internacional o global son mandatos de Naciones Unidas, de la Unión Europea, y que van bajando, ¿no? Se van bajando desde lo más formal hasta lo más crítico, de posturas críticas, ¿no? Entonces, a mi modo de entender es eso, o sea, que nos dejen de ver como unos sujetos vaciados de todo sentido y que Occidente nos va a llenar de todo lo posible. Y en ese sentido, por lo tanto, también considerar que al haber sido construidos como tales, como son sujetos vaciados, en el marco del progreso no tenemos ciertas habilidades y se nos exige a un sinnúmero de realidades que nos enredan, que nos cuesta de alguna manera como articular, y se repite esta lógica y al mismo tiempo nos tienen atados a unos presupuestos, además pocos, porque somos pequeñas poblaciones, porque somos, o sea, son unos proyectos que yo no trabajo con nadie, yo soy parte de la propia comunidad. Cuando nos llegan los presupuestos a nosotros, son presupuestos que no responden a ningún cambio, no responden realmente O sea, en muchas de las ocasiones nosotros tenemos que poner las agendas no nuestras para recibir financiamientos. Y eso es perverso, a mi modo de ver, es muy perverso, porque son políticas dadas que se dan a veces entre estados, entre instituciones, y son muy perversas. Entonces nosotros sí mantenemos como una criticidad de las lógicas del financiamiento y cómo juegan no solamente las cuestiones técnicas, sino también las simbólicas y las relaciones de norte-sur. Eso.
That was beautiful, Letitia, in the way you came kind of full circle, that really the only way that change happens is by us all personally doing the work to decolonize our own minds in the way we're doing things. So I will pass it over to Sonia. I'm really eager to hear your last thoughts or any takeaways for the audience.
Wow, for the audience. I'm still thinking about Hailey's question, like how do we measure success? And yeah, and also about Kimmy's input regarding how most of the methods that we use to measure success right now are they're still very racist, they're still very colonial, they're still very patriarchal. Like there's a lot of inequalities in there, and it's because they do not take into account the voices of people they consider, I don't know, there's a word Kimmy used, subordinate, is it? Yeah. So so I think the takeaway for program managers, for everyone, for organizers, for funders would be that, like, how do we measure success? Like maybe, not even maybe, it's time to reframe how we're measuring it. And part of reframing that, then it means involving, like actively involving the people that you're purporting to serve or fund or help or whatever. And that means local communities, for instance, indigenous communities, marginalized communities, minorities, and yeah, like John said, like all stakeholders, all people, all social actors need to be involved in that. And part of now using that knowledge to create better ways of measuring success. I'd give an example maybe of, we have an indigenous funder in East Africa, they're called UHAI. And our conversations that we're now having is how do we even start reporting for projects, right? Like you can, like how do I maybe as someone who hasn't had access to a certain kind of education, does not have the right lingo, like the right politics to sound, I don't know, work, or like to sound like I know what I need to do, like the right language for funding. How do I even begin to apply for some of these grants? How do I start reporting for them? So some of the considerations have been, maybe let's start reporting via videos. Maybe let's start allowing people to report in their language, in their local languages, right? Yeah, and you see in that approach, you've involved the communities, and now they're helping you to co-create knowledge that now helps everybody. And also, I'm thinking about Kimmy's strategy of reinterpreting history, right? Like, yeah, I think also part of creating knowledge is that, like what does it mean to, like history does play a lot, and I feel in this reinterpretation, if people who have been marginalized and minoritized are now the center of this, I think now we stand a better chance of coming up with maybe strategies and engagement that is not so, like where we do not have this power play where the North is the North, or like the men, or like the people who have access get to speak over everyone else. They get to be the only voice that gets heard. Yeah.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you to all of our panelists today. We have run out of a little time to do the question and answer. However, I feel like we were having some great conversation. There was some great feedback in our chat. And if there are any dire questions that you would like to hear answered from our participants, we can have them answer those questions and we can share their responses on our website. Also, I did forget to mention that everyone's full bio is available on the ICN website as well, if you would like to go read those in English or French or perhaps Spanish. So I'm going to pass it over to Gaziwa to make some final remarks. And I really appreciate everybody's time here today. This is an amazing piece of work that you have and a journey that you have gone on. And I can't wait to learn more. So thank you very much for your time. Welalin.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you to the panelists for sharing their valuable work on ICN research project and for helping us to rethink public engagement through a decolonial, anti-racist and feminist lens. So we work for a better world and a more just world. Thank you all for having been with us today. Please don't forget to subscribe to ICN newsletter and join ICN social media, which were shared in the chat box. Thank you again and have a wonderful day.